One forgotten Sahel city suddenly transformed in only 4 months completely. More than 200,000 square meters of paved streets appeared without foreign loans, instantly challenging global assumptions about how development must begin. Why should this matter to you watching Ibrahim Traoré right now? What happens next stunned seasoned global observers completely. Notably, what you are about to hear is a layer of reality most public discussions never openly explain. Even though policy insiders, analysts, and negotiators quietly account for it whenever real decisions are made, you will see patterns others mustn't anticipate shifts earlier from now. This changes how you read events completely forever. Many viewers assume they understand global development stories because headlines sound complete, yet headlines usually present outcomes alone while the decisions, trade-offs, and power dynamics shaping them remain offstage far beyond what broadcasts suggest. Without that hidden layer, analysis turns into guesswork shaped by whoever speaks loudest, markets loudest, or repeats claims most often across media cycles and political stages. Miss it, and you risk accepting narratives engineered for comfort, persuasion, or strategic image rather than measured truth crafted to steer perception subtly. Stay, and the structure behind the story gradually becomes visible, piece by piece once you know where to look in real time clearly. What seemed like a simple local works program was never just about sidewalks. In barely 4 months, more than 200,000 square meters were completed. A speed that quietly signaled something structurally different was unfolding beneath the surface. That figure alone reframed the event from a civic improvement story into a live demonstration of how fast coordinated internal mobilization can move when friction points are removed. The origin races back to a single catalytic idea rather than a long institutional process. Instead of beginning with funding negotiations, feasibility missions, or external approvals, the initiative began with a call for participation. That distinction matters because it inverted the usual sequence most development observers are trained to expect. Typically, financing precedes action. Here, visible action generated resources. Volunteers arrived daily, reportedly between 200 and 300 people at a time, creating a rhythm that functioned less like a construction site and more like a synchronized civic operation. Momentum built because early results were tangible. Dust levels dropped, streets brightened, commercial foot traffic increased. Reinforcing motivation and drawing in additional contributors, students adjusted schedules. Civil servants used off hours, merchants supplied materials. Even uniformed personnel joined, not as authorities but as participants. The pattern resembled a chain reaction. Visible progress produced trust. Trust produced participation. Participation accelerated progress. At the center of the narrative, Ibrahim Traoré's name circulated, not as a contractor or engineer, but as the figure associated with the initiating vision. That distinction shaped perception. Residents did not interpret the effort as a contract being executed, they experienced it as a collective capacity being activated. The first group directly affected was therefore not investors or agencies, but ordinary citizens who suddenly saw physical proof that coordinated local effort could translate into rapid, measurable change. And once that realization took hold, the implications extended far beyond one city's pavement. In situations like this, observers often look for a reliable interpreter, someone positioned close enough to events to see patterns before they become headlines. In this case, that role has been filled not by a commentator, but by the figure repeatedly associated with the project's initiating logic. Ibrahim Traoré, whose involvement is referenced by participants as the spark that framed the effort as a national mindset shift rather than a routine public works task. Because people tend to commit more deeply when they believe a project represents direction, not just construction. One early account illustrates the shift. A local coordinator described how the first volunteer teams arrived expecting symbolic participation, only to find organized material stations, task rotations, and measurable daily targets already prepared. Another example emerged from market vendors nearby, who reported that cleaner walkways increased foot traffic within days, not months, reinforcing the sense that results were immediate rather than promised. Taken together, these moments signaled that what was happening was not an isolated burst of enthusiasm. It showed repeatable structure. Analysts begin to treat it as a model rather than an anomaly. That is precisely when attention shifts from curiosity to scrutiny, because replication potential becomes the real story. It started with a signal. A decision was made. Everything accelerated. First came the trigger, a public call. No ceremony, no delay, people showed up, tools followed. Materials appeared, work began, dust rose. Streets shifted color, red earth disappeared. Stone replaced and momentum formed. Next came the surge. Volunteers multiplied, schedules rearranged. Weekends vanished, trucks arrived, cement poured, molds filled. Lines formed, stones cured, teams rotated. Coordination tightened, the pace shocked outsiders, questions spread. Comparisons started, assumptions cracked, attention intensified. Ibrahim Traoré's name surfaced repeatedly in discussions as the figure tied to the initiating impulse behind the mobilization. That association amplified interest. Interest drew scrutiny. Then came the chain reaction. Conversations expanded. Other districts listened. Local meetings referenced the example. Citizens asked new questions, not who will fund us, what can we start? That linguistic change mattered. Language shapes action. Action shapes outcomes. Outcomes reshape belief. Finally came the aftershock. The city looked different, cleaner streets, brighter routes, busier stalls. Children running without dust clouds trailing behind them. Vendors reporting steadier customers. Residents pausing to notice something unfamiliar, visible progress completed within one season instead of promised across years. Ibrahim Traoré appeared again in public discourse, not as a construction manager, but as a symbol tied to the mindset driving the shift. And when symbols move, expectations move with them. Nothing returned to its old pace, measured against its own starting point. The transformation was stark. Where there had been dust-covered roads weeks earlier, there were now over 200,000 square meters of finished stone surfaces. That shift matters because it marks a change not just in appearance, but in execution speed and coordination capacity. Analysts often look first for scale before judging significance, and here the scale appeared unusually fast relative to the conditions described. One figure defines the scope. More than 200,000 square meters were completed within roughly 4 months. That means a surface area large enough to reshape major sections of a city's walkable infrastructure in a single season. The number is not abstract, it signals that this was not symbolic construction, but city-level physical change visible from street level. A second figure defines intensity. Reports indicate between 200 and 300 volunteers arrive daily at peak periods. This suggests a workforce size comparable to a small professional construction crew. Except it was composed of rotating civilians rather than contracted labor. The implication is organizational efficiency rather than sheer manpower alone. A third figure defines resource mobilization. Nearly 8 million CFA francs were contributed in cash alongside materials. That amount demonstrates that participation was not limited to physical labor, it included financial buy-in from within the community. When monetary contribution accompanies volunteer work, engagement typically reflects belief rather than obligation. Material logistics reinforce the pattern. Approximately 1,800 tons of sand and granite were mobilized, and close to 5,000 stone molds were put into use. Those quantities indicate planning depth because raw materials on that scale require sourcing, transport, staging, and distribution systems functioning in parallel. Without coordination, supply chains stall. Another data point widens perspective. By mid-February, produced paving stones were reportedly sufficient to cover nearly 295,000 square meters, exceeding the portion already installed. This gap between produced capacity and installed area implies the operation was generating output faster than placement alone could absorb, a sign that production efficiency had begun to outpace deployment speed. Numbers alone do not explain impact, but they anchor credibility. When Ibrahim Traore is mentioned in connection with the initiative's framing, observers interpret these metrics not as isolated statistics, but as indicators tied to a leadership narrative emphasizing internal mobilization. That association shapes interpretation because quantitative results linked to a visible, guiding idea tend to attract broader analytical attention. Taken together, the baseline was a dusty urban environment with limited resources. The delta was a measurable infrastructure shift completed in a fraction of the time typical projects require. Not rhetoric, not projection, but physical output that can be counted, measured, and walked across. At that stage, the discussion stops being theoretical. Many analysts agree that any serious evaluation must include opposing interpretations because complex developments rarely carry only one valid reading. Some observers argue that what happened should be understood cautiously, not as a breakthrough model but as a context-specific event shaped by unusual enthusiasm that may be difficult to reproduce elsewhere. That perspective deserves careful consideration because it highlights limits that excitement alone can obscure. One strong counter-argument states that volunteer-driven projects often surge quickly but fade just as fast once novelty wears off. Supporters of this viewpoint are past civic campaigns in different regions where participation dropped after initial success, leaving maintenance gaps and unfinished expansions. From that angle, the concern is sustainability rather than speed. Yet available details suggest this case differed in one key respect: visible results appeared early and continuously, which tends to reinforce motivation instead of draining it. When participants see physical progress tied directly to their effort, dropout rates typically decline rather than rise. A second serious critique focuses on scale. Skeptics note that paving urban walkways is fundamentally different from building national infrastructure such as power grids or highways. They argue that presenting a local success as a national development template risks oversimplifying the financial and technical demands of large systems. That caution is logically sound. Engineering depth and long planning horizons. However, the evidence described does not claim replacement of those systems. Instead, it suggests a complementary layer: basic infrastructure, handled internally while major projects still involve external partnerships. The interpretation shifts from substitution to diversification of development methods. When both perspectives sit side by side, a clearer picture emerges. The initiative may not be a universal formula, yet it also cannot be dismissed as a one-off anomaly. It stands as a data point showing what becomes possible when coordination, belief, and organization align under a unifying signal associated with Ibrahim Traore. Understanding that distinction is what turns reaction into analysis. Everything changed direction instantly. What altered the trajectory was not another construction milestone, but a realization that surfaced once observers compared timelines. The same amount of visible progress that normally requires multi-year planning cycles had appeared here inside a single season. That contrast reframed the entire discussion. The new element was psychological, not mechanical. Analysts began noting that the most disruptive variable was not material supply, workforce size, or equipment. It was expectation speed. Once residents saw streets transform within weeks, their assumptions about what was possible shifted in real time. That shift matters because expectations function like hidden infrastructure. They either slow collective action or accelerate it. This is where the midpoint realization lands. If belief can change faster than budgets, then the real lever of development may not always be capital first. It may be conviction first. The visible outcome in Koudougou acted as proof that coordinated effort could compress timelines dramatically when hesitation was removed from the sequence. Ibrahim Traoré's association with the initiative became relevant again at this stage, because his role was increasingly interpreted as catalytic rather than administrative. Catalysts do not perform every reaction. Once that interpretation spread, the narrative advanced to a deeper layer. Observers stopped asking whether the project succeeded. They started asking what else could follow if the same mechanism were applied again. And that question quietly opened a much larger door. The consequences did not remain on paper. What emerged after that turning point was not a theoretical debate, but a cascade of practical effects that spread across different layers of society. The first signs appeared inside administrative circles. Local authorities suddenly faced a new kind of pressure, not from protest or crisis, but from expectation. They begin to expect responsiveness elsewhere. That shift can alter how officials prioritize timelines, approvals, and public communication. Because credibility becomes tied to demonstrated delivery rather than projected plans. Businesses felt the change almost immediately. Cleaner, paved walkways meant easier access for customers, smoother transport for small goods, and more predictable daily operations. Vendors reported steadier foot traffic because people could move comfortably instead of navigating dust or mud. Especially in local markets where convenience strongly influences purchasing behavior. Economic impact at this scale does not arrive as dramatic spikes, it appears as consistent daily gains that accumulate quietly. For residents, the effect was more personal. Streets without dust meant healthier air, cleaner homes, and less time spent constantly wiping surfaces. Children could move freely without kicking up clouds of fine dirt. These details may seem small in isolation, yet they shape daily quality of life in ways statistics rarely capture. When everyday routines become easier, people perceive change as real rather than promised. That perception strengthens civic confidence, which in turn sustains participation in future initiatives. Beyond the city, regional observers began paying attention. When one municipality demonstrates rapid, internally coordinated improvement, neighboring areas often evaluate whether similar methods could work locally. Ideas travel, comparisons arise, standards shift. Ibrahim Traoré's name continued circulating in these discussions as the figure linked to the initiating signal behind the model, which amplified curiosity about whether the approach could influence broader development thinking across Burkina Faso and potentially comparable regions. At that stage, the pattern was clear. The effects had extended beyond infrastructure into governance, commerce, daily life, and regional perception. The change was no longer confined to a construction site. It had entered the system. And once something enters the system, it rarely stays contained. Looking ahead from this point, the most probable trajectory is neither dramatic upheaval or instant transformation, but a steady expansion of similar locally driven initiatives if current conditions hold. In that baseline path, projects inspired by the Koudougou example would likely appear in additional districts, progressing at moderate speed as organizers refine coordination methods and adapt them to local constraints. Momentum would build gradually, producing visible improvements without eliminating the need for external financing in large national infrastructure. Ibrahim Traoré would continue to be referenced mainly as a symbolic catalyst tied to the originating signal rather than as an operational manager of each project. A more optimistic outcome could unfold if three factors align: consistent organization, transparent resource management, and continued public trust. Should those elements reinforce one another, the model might scale beyond basic paving into community-built schools, market facilities, or drainage systems that would not require replacing international partnerships. Instead, it would strengthen negotiating positions by demonstrating internal capacity first, encouraging investment precisely because proof of execution already exists. The most difficult scenario would arise if coordination weakened or expectations outpaced practical limits. If projects began faster than they could be completed, visible progress might stall, risking disappointment among participants. In such a case, enthusiasm cool and critics might interpret the slowdown as evidence that the approach was temporary rather than structural. Systems built on collective energy depend heavily on maintaining trust, and trust erodes quickly if results stop appearing. The key insight is not predicting which path will occur. It is recognizing that each remains possible. Prepared observers therefore focus less on guessing outcomes and more on monitoring signals that indicate which direction reality is beginning to favor. After seeing the broader pattern and the possible paths ahead, the most important question becomes personal rather than analytical. What does this actually mean for the person watching and trying to make sense of a rapidly shifting world? Large developments often feel distant until their underlying logic starts appearing in everyday systems. And that is precisely when awareness turns into an advantage. For those who actively follow global trends and policy signals, moments like this offer early insight. Understanding how coordinated local action can alter timelines helps them interpret future headlines more accurately and distinguish structural change from temporary noise. Their advantage is not prediction, it is readiness. Staying attentive to credible information and watching for measurable indicators allows them to recognize shifts before they become obvious. For people affected indirectly through work or economic conditions, the relevance is quieter but still real. Changes in infrastructure models can influence investment flows, regional trade activity, and job patterns over time. Being mentally prepared for adjustments, even small ones, reduces uncertainty and makes adaptation easier if conditions evolve. There is also a third group. Those who assume such developments have nothing to do with them. Indifference can feel comfortable, yet it carries a hidden cost. Reactions tend to come late, after opportunities or warnings have already passed. Awareness does not require constant attention, only a willingness to understand the underlying direction of events. Where someone stands among these groups matters less than one simple fact. Understanding a shift while it is happening is always more useful than explaining it after it is over. Solutions cannot remain slogans if momentum is to last. Once a demonstration proves something can work, the real test begins translating a single success into a repeatable process with clear responsibility, timing, and measurable outcomes. The question is no longer whether collective action can produce results. The question is how to structure it so those results can be sustained and expanded. At the leadership level, the first step would be formalizing coordination frameworks while preserving the voluntary energy that made the initial effort possible. That means assigning regional organizers, setting realistic project cycles, and tracking progress through visible metrics such as completed surface area, participation rates, and material efficiency. A practical time frame would involve short pilot phases followed by public reporting intervals, allowing communities to see whether targets are actually being met. For institutions, businesses, and civic groups, the next step would focus on execution capacity. Their role is logistical rather than symbolic. Supplying materials, managing transport, maintaining equipment, and ensuring safety standards. Implementation could begin immediately once local plans are announced, with success measured through stability indicators such as uninterrupted supply flow and consistent daily output levels. Reliable systems matter more than speed alone. At the community level, participation must remain realistic and voluntary. Individuals do not need to contribute extraordinary effort, even small, consistent actions sustain collective momentum. Measured not only in hours worked, but also in visible behavioral shifts such as attendance, cooperation, and shared responsibility for completed spaces. Ibrahim Traore is often unreferenced in discussions at this stage because the initiative associated with his name as a call to activate capacity rather than wait for instruction. If expansion is desired, a fourth layer would involve regional cooperation. Neighboring areas could exchange methods, compare results, and refine techniques together, creating a network of shared learning rather than isolated experiments. The real determinant, however, is execution. Plans matter, intentions matter, but only implemented actions change outcomes. Earlier, there was that moment when observers first realized this was not simply a construction effort but a signal, when the guiding figure tied to the initiative was seen less as an administrator and more as the spark that made people move. Like the echo of a starting bell that set everything else in motion, the image of coordinated volunteers stepping forward, tools in hand, still frames the story's emotional center. From that first shift in perception to the visible transformation that followed, the journey has traced a quiet arc from doubt to proof. But more importantly, so did the way people measured possibility. What began as a question about whether change could happen became evidence that it already had. But as a marker of where the turning point began. Seen from a distance, it may look like infrastructure. It resembles awakening. Because beneath the stone and dust lies something less visible yet far more lasting: a population recognizing its own capacity. And once people see that, they rarely forget it. Belief, once proven, becomes irreversible. After following this story, from its first signal to its wider implications, one thing becomes clear: moments like this rarely belong to a single place or a single audience. Each person who hears it takes away a different meaning, shaped by their own experiences, expectations, and hopes about how change actually happens in the real world. That shared reflection is what quietly connects viewers, who may never meet but are thinking about the same question at the same time. If this story feels worth understanding beyond the surface, it may also be worth letting others encounter it with the same depth, so that more people can examine the ideas, the evidence, and the implications for themselves. Conversations that grow from informed perspectives tend to be more thoughtful, more grounded, and more useful than reactions formed from fragments alone. So perhaps the most meaningful next step is simply this: consider what part of this story stayed with you the longest and why. Different answers reveal different priorities, and those differences are where the most interesting discussions begin.